In a world obsessed with quick fixes and results-driven clinical outcomes, what if true healing lies in the messy, unpredictable space of radical care? How do we move beyond band-aids and embrace a practice of holding each other through grief, of containing the pain and rage that arise from systemic oppression? What does a radical act of care look like in daily practice for ourselves, with others, with our clients, and in community? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Sun. Our guest today is Sahar Al-Najjar, an adjunct professor of psychology and relational psychodynamic therapist. Sahar holds 2 master's degrees, one in counseling from Loyola University and one in clinical psychology from the Adler University, where she is currently completing her 4th year in the Doctor of Psychology and Clinical Psychology degree. Sahar has published in peer-reviewed journals and multicultural counseling textbooks, and wrote an important paper titled A Decolonial Framework to Addressing Clinical Care, Bridging Community and Clinical Psychology, which was published in the American Journal of Community Psychology. So in both her clinical and research specialty, Sahar focuses on immigrant and refugee populations and centers the lived experiences and voices of minoritized communities. To further exemplify her contributions, Sahar was the recipient of the 2023 Albert Schweitzer Fellowship and in 2024, the Illinois Board of Higher Education DFI Fellowship. Today, our guest, Sahar Al-Najjar, a Palestinian American therapist and scholar, will be discussing and guiding us through the idea of leaning into radical care towards one another, with one another, and for one another. Sahar, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for creating this space.
Well, I know that for our podcast, we actually, I myself took a winter break. And so, such a opportune topic to have. But before we get into that, though, can you tell me a little bit more about some of the work and projects that you're currently involved in?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I am, as you said, a current doctoral student and a professor of psychology, an adjunct professor. And currently, my biggest project is my dissertation that I just received IRB approval for in October of 2024. And I've been just data collecting for my dissertation over my winter break. So that's my biggest project right now, alongside teaching. It's a new spring semester. I'm back in the classroom later this afternoon teaching fresh faces, which is something to always, I always look forward to. So yeah, that's kind of what's on my plate right now.
Yeah. So it looks like for your winter break, you had to focus on your dissertation. So, I guess, why don't you tell me a little bit more about this idea, for our listeners who we've had a few episodes where we talk about self-care, but I think this idea is a little nuanced here, which is radical care towards one another, with one another, and for one another. What does that mean?
It's a multi-layered feeling and sentiment of being in community, reaching out to community, cultivating community amidst so much that is ever changing, right? Whether that's the political world we live in or even our own spaces in community. So for me, that looks like, the naming that the past, since 2023, the past 2 years has been very, very complex. As a Palestinian doctoral student within the ivory tower, as an academic, as a clinician, seeing genocide of my own people televised has been very complex. And so it has been very isolating as well. So for me, being able to create community, to create spaces, to reach out to folks, to check in on folks has been really, really pertinent. and reminding ourselves that it's okay to feel grief. It's okay to, a lot of colleagues of mine and myself included feel a lot of guilt as well with, being here in the diaspora and feeling so limited in what we can do. And so it is a continuation of a commitment to uplift one another. And that can be several things. That can be sending a check-in message. That can be, taking the risk to speak out. That can be writing through grief. That can be dropping off a meal. It can be all those beautiful things, so that's kind of what it looks like for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I honestly, I'm sorry is the best thing I can say. And really, there's no words to explain the fact that this genocide is still ongoing. And in fact, I've had other Palestinian speakers that have mentioned that this happened a long time ago. It's just very systematic. It's gradual. It's just more broadcasted now, in a sense. And for you to work in a mental health space while navigating this, like you said, feeling guilt that you're here, I think it is very pertinent to this idea of how do you take care of yourself. And, we don't want to get into comparisons in terms of how many psychologists or mental health professionals may be worse off or whatever. But I guess this idea of many of us are undergoing the pressures of what society and systems have placed onto us. So you mentioned some of these little tips, right? Reaching out, sending a meal, checking in with others. Did you have a framework for that, or just organically you're just saying, hey, well, what makes me feel good? How did you come up with that? Yeah.
I appreciate you, reframing that. Absolutely. For me, it's just showing up. The task of the ability to show up and co-creating with someone, what it is that they need. I've noticed a lot of folks in community that I'm close to each need different things, and including myself, right? Some days we have the energy to go out and go to a rally, a protest. Some days we channel our grief through writing. Some days, we need a warm Palestinian lentil soup, right? Some days it's, just a message, just saying, hey, I see you. I know things have been heavy. So it's really tailored to where folks are at in the day-to-day, a holistic approach to showing up and leaning into difficult dialogues, not with a goal to fix or to change, but with a goal to just contain and to hold, especially in a hyper-fixated world, hyper-accelerated world. And this is maybe the psychodynamic in me speaking of like looking at results, right? Shying away from that, not looking at necessarily taking away someone's grief or depressive symptomology, but really honoring it and saying, I'm not just going to celebrate you for waking up today and trying one more day, but celebrating the grief sometimes, sitting with that, holding space for that. And so that's kind of what I allude to when my framework is just showing up for folks in ways that feel safe for them and that feel helpful for them.
Yeah. And well, you're also hitting on something important here, which is it goes beyond just showing up. You're showing up in a way where you're creating space where we are not trying to fix things. Like you said, we live in a culture where things are so outcome driven. Hey, we got to fix your grief. We need to make you less depressed as the outcome. Mm-hmm. And that must be very tough, particularly people who are, I guess, trying to pursue this outcome-driven, evidence-based care. What's the evidence that you're getting better?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Especially, in my clinical training, that's what we largely focus on is diagnostic criterion, symptomology, and treatment. And from a holistic approach, maybe Rogerian even, is being able to shy away from that, put the manual down, put the DSM down, and just be human with someone else, right? And humanize their experience and their narrative, the narrative and community of, folks have really been hurting. And like you said earlier on in this podcast, it isn't something, the genocide occurring in Gaza isn't something that is a one-time isolated event. I spent over the break a lot of time with my grandmother, who during the routine semester, it's really hard to see family. It was just being on the go. And my grandmother, who actually is a survivor of the Nakba, which is a story that is common for many Palestinians and their family members keeping their keys and so forth. My grandmother, who plays a really integral role in my life, of the importance of remembering, right? And continuing to remember our history, and not forget our history as a catalyst to what, what we're doing and what we want to achieve as Palestinians in diaspora, was looking at the news as I was sitting and having tea with her, and they were providing an update on the last standing hospital in Gaza. And she was in Arabic, very, very poetically telling me about her experiences and how to her this is no different than her experience from the Nakba. And it's a reoccurrence, if you will. And so with my grandma, it's creating space to ask questions, to say, what does she remember? What does she recollect? How does it feel for her right now, seeing this again, many generations later? I'm her granddaughter, and creating space for difficult dialogues. It was certainly very, very emotionally heavy to hear her recollections that are so identical to what we're seeing on a TV screen now. And the colleagues of mine that I have back there in Gaza, back home in Gaza, that are recollecting very similar narratives. So,
Gosh. It takes so much courage to have these difficult conversations, and it really does challenge this idea that oftentimes when we think about BIPOC clinicians or people of color, how there's a stigma about discussing these difficult topics, yet your grandma and you were able to lean into that and connect in the most vulnerable way, revisiting the trauma that she experienced and not shy away from those conversations. So that I just want to acknowledge a lot of the bravery that happened for that to occur.
thank you.
Yeah. Now, for our listeners, who are thinking about this idea of self-care, connection, community, are there any other specific messages you'd like to share?
Absolutely. I think you and I initially, when we first met, we talked about something that I sat with after our meeting, which was risk. And it is that, to me, sat on my heart, and in ways that I think were beautiful, right? What does it mean to take a risk? What does it look like to take a risk, to reach out, to integrate oneself in community, to hold difficult dialogues? So for me, it's certainly taking the risk, whatever that looks like, now more than ever. Be unapologetic about the ways that we show up with love and for love and to love one another, especially as we see so much disseminated to rubble. But one thing that doesn't get disseminated and will never be disseminated is if you know a Palestinian, you know that Palestinians love to love, and that is the ability to love on others in ways, again, that are of care, from a care praxis. And so for me, it's just being able to, again, show up for folks, with folks, through our grief, with our grief. And every time I try to do that, I always tell people in my life, like, we are a mosaic, right? Like, we are, our life is like a mosaic. We're filled with everyone else that every person we've ever encountered and met. And so in my work, I always, both clinically and in community, remember the cornerstones, like people I came across. And I always remember a dear friend of mine, my sister in this field and beyond, Dr. Hana Masood, who's actually a community psychologist, who always would tell me, right through the grief, right? Do not let the pain numb you to the ability where you're no longer to feel, because pain does that. Traumatization does that. It numbs us of the ability to not just feel our grief, but to connect and to reach out, because we become desensitized. And so there's a lot of work that Palestinian poets these days are articulating, the ability to not let systems desensitize us, even in the face of dehumanization. And so that's also something I kind of pull from, is her wisdom in sharing with me to continue to write, to continue to connect, even when it is most difficult, even when there is all of the risk in the world. It is to speak up, even in systems that often is exhausting, to kind of what felt like to educate, to try to champion, why we deserve humanization, why we are humans, why we deserve empathy, and so forth. And in the psychological system, which has been in many ways alienating and exhausting, but it is to continue to commit to speaking up while we have a voice. And that's what we owe. We owe, as Hala Aliyan, Palestinian poet, says, we owe Gaza and Palestine our endurance. So it is always and will forever be Palestinian women that come before me that bleed into the way I show up and the ways I show up for myself and for others.
Yeah. And so as you're taking the maybe the energy, the relationships that essentially are motivating you and fueling your work, you've also talked about shifting from community psychology more so to clinical psychology. So, can you share with us any memorable events and circumstances that influenced how you got into this work?
Absolutely. So my psychology journey starts many moons ago as an undergrad student at a public university, Governor State University in Chicago. I was the only Palestinian cohort. I was only Palestinian in my cohort, and I had taken a capstone class in my senior year. It was my last class before graduating, and the capstone class was psychological issues and social values. The instructor for that course was a newly hired Palestinian American scholar and professor, which within itself was transformative on day one, which I have not come across or seen someone that looked like me, that upheld the same values as me since that course my senior year. And this, individual as a Palestinian scholar who not just academically but personally and professionally mentored me, encouraged me to apply to grad school, would always say, okay, what's the next step? And she also was really inclusive of my very diverse and various identities. She wasn't just inclusive, but also celebrated each part of who I was, really creating a home for me in many ways, professionally, personally, as a Palestinian American queer undergraduate psychology student at the time, still trying to find my way in the world and who I was, right? She saw something in me and said, you have such an interest for psychology, and, I'm here behind you to support you. And she really was the reason why I fell in love with psychology, and was eager to continue learning and growing alongside her and her mentorship at the time. And the what we call chosen family, having her as chosen family, it taught me really everything I needed to know in the field and beyond. And her presence and teachings really left an imprint on my heart many, many years later. So this was back in 2017. Now we're in 2025. So it's been a number of years, but I do not forget, her imprint really, and how I started and where I started. Absolutely.
Hmm. So she saw something early on
Yeah.
beyond just the interest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you suppose that was?
I can't really put my finger on what it was exactly, but in that capstone course, I was just so interested in the projects that she created. She was so invested. She was very energetic, very invested in the class, and I do believe, and I've carried on actually her way of facilitating a course in my own classes. Right when I
Wow. Oh.
Yes, as an instructor, and I will never forget on the last day she created like a potluck and brought Palestinian, Middle Eastern food as a celebration, as a wrap up, because we know food, breaking bread, if you will, brings people together, even across our differences. Food has that power in bringing folks together in those capacities. And so I found myself doing the very same thing when I started teaching in 2021, which is just a few years ago. The first class I ever taught, psychology class, I carried on that kind of spirit of bringing students together and celebrating students the way she celebrated me, and bringing in, falafel and hummus and pita bread. And these are just, appetizers really, but giving a piece of love and community care in that way to my students, the way she did for me and others outside of psychology, but bridging psychology and community care in those ways. So,
Yeah. In your career as a person of color, what were some challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
many, many, many. I get asked this question a lot from close friends of mine who are considering applying to grad school, whether master's or doctorate. As someone who's went through an independent master's program, it really took the long journey, if you will, then started a doctorate. I would say the most challenging, well, maybe even most salient, is identifying as a queer Palestinian within the system. Those are two identities that I'm very proud of, but it has felt very alienating to be the only Palestinian, for one, in my clinical cohort, and with a feeling alienated in clinical spaces generally within my clinical training. So every year of our PsyD doctoral program, we're in practicum as externs on rotation for assessment, psychotherapy, advanced, and as well, this is before the pre-doctoral internship. And it has been so nuanced to not see another Palestinian every single year within this training, and kind of the diverse identity that we uphold and the different needs that we uphold, feeling really alienated in those ways. I've seen firsthand like the disavowal of my identity, exclusion of my people in ways that are traumatic and dehumanizing. It's pulled a lot out of me, and in ways pulled me to therapy, pulled me to my own therapy, to a diet, to start addressing this harm and addressing what I'm seeing. I recollect very, very intimately in the beginning of my training, my first year, an excited, fresh first-year doctoral student ready to take on the world. Very proud that I got into a doctoral program. I had a professor look at me and say to in an ethics class, introductory ethics class in the doctoral program, say, students, one population I don't work with is Palestinians because their people are always at war. And that was, and he looked directly at me. I was the only Palestinian in the room.
Wait, hold on. I have to take a quick pause. Openly said this in a classroom.
Openly, yes.
And this is quite recent.
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Yes. I had my colleagues, look at me because I always talked about my identity as a Palestinian, our community as a Palestinian within a clinical framework. And he made an example, this instructor made an example out of me as to a population that, that's of his limitation of who he can't work with. And when we talk about the risk to speak up, right, as we've started kind of this in the beginning, there was a moment where I felt so much in my body. The body really does keep the score, in a way where there was so much pain, so much anger, so much frustration, hurt, but not shame, because there's nothing that is shameful about being Palestinian. But these systems do, in a way, with individuals as such, implicate harm that are meant to invalidate, to target, to make one feel small. So this experience, amongst really many others, years later, ongoing, and even rampant, now more than ever, the harm that we're seeing, I overcome these challenges of xenophobia and calling it out for what it is, racism, by committing to work harder, for Palestinian students in my doctoral program who've come after me. There's a lot more Palestinian scholars in training now in our program than when I started, which warms my heart, and it feels like a duty to almost in some ways protect them and to create safer spaces for them in ways where when I started I didn't have, and to build community, to create a safety net to lean on has been one of the catalysts to continue to reflect on grief and in these experiences.
Yeah. In recognizing you're not in this alone. And so, yeah. Wow. So in many ways, you've also answered a question I ask all my guest speakers, which is, what does it mean for you to be a Palestinian American psychologist?
Also very, very multi-layered. It never comes down to one thing, right? For me to be a queer Palestinian American clinical psychologist, it means to commit to a lifetime of advocacy beyond the classroom or clinic. To me, it is to destigmatize and humanize our grief, historic and ongoing. It is to lean into discomfort and to tend to it. It is to not treat others as disposable at the mere presence of conflict. This can look like advocating for one another. To me, it looks like advocating for one another and our right to exist, our right to love, our right to our community's welfare, for the welfare of those on the front lines, and those who have lost their right to speak. In every room and in every clinic across these, really colonial borders, as we call it, and attempts that are very erasure, especially where there's something to risk. That is what it means to me to be a Palestinian American psychologist who authentically commits to an ethics of care. It's to continually reflect on forces of hegemony that structure not just the social, but the social that becomes structuralized into the psyche, and work towards radical healing as a collective together. As you said, it's not something that's done alone.
Thank you for sharing. As you're describing this experience, I feel beyond just a message. I feel there within the message, us having this conversation, it's almost as though just speaking, it creates the will to live. Just speaking creates the space that we are here.
Yes.
Gosh. Yeah. So Sahar, how can we support you?
Your podcast itself has been so healing and supportive. For me, as a relational psychodynamic therapist, I believe in the power of narrative and relationally connecting to one another, and you creating the space through your podcast, not just me, but others, as you've said, uplifting the commitment to continue uplifting the work of other Palestinian American scholars here in the diaspora and beyond borders. That is the most meaningful support that I could receive. The ability to connect with another in dialogue and to talk about these very experiences, both joyful and experiences that are painful, and being able to authentically be oneself and to take that risk to speak up, and is to me very supportive. So I appreciate you so much for allowing and curating space to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I mean, I know it's a risk. I mean, most speakers, myself can get on here and talk, but just given the political climate, having a Palestinian American come up here and speak holds a higher risk. And not just, but the fact that you're sharing these ideas in which we can consider self-care. And within the context of what you're describing holds much greater meaning. And so Sahar, any final thoughts for our listeners?
The final sentiment I think that I sit with, and that I'm grateful to be able to sit with, is sumud, steadfastness. And so I will, the kind of last message I'll give folks listening here today with us is to continue to commit and embody sumud. And sumud can be choosing to get up and choosing to share your narrative, or to uplift someone else's narrative. Sumud can be creating a meal for yourself, or committing to take that shower that is, we see that really difficult these days for folks to kind of engage in. And so it can be enacted in many, many different ways, but it can also be enacted collectively. It doesn't have to be a singular thing. As Audre Lorde said, revolution is not liberation, is not a one-time event. And same thing with sumud. It isn't a one-time event. It's a daily enactment for liberation. So that is my last sentiment. I thank you so very much.
All right. Thank you so much for being on our podcast.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.